She was Australia's catch-me-if-you-can con artist.
Trying to pin her in one spot was difficult.
Jody Harris was a master identity thief.
We've had $10,000 stolen, and I've just gone, what?
She fooled her victims.
You gonna stick with your real name now?
And she fooled the police.
When you've got a profile like that, you're going to get a lot of hits.
Adam Shan reveals the amazing chase to capture the Queen of Con.
So you're literally minutes behind her as she's committing offences?
Minutes behind her.
And we expose her trail of destruction.
I don't know, it feels like a bloody nightmare that I don't know when it's going to end.
March 8, 2006 was a day that Leah Jury will never forget. That day, she left Melbourne on a well-deserved vacation. First, a quick flight to Brisbane, and then on to a luxury cruise liner. But this trip would not be the stuff of happy memories.
So that day I was going on holiday. I was in business class and my friend was in economy. So we were all very happy and looking forward to our holiday.
Leah worked for Qantas as a flight attendant for 20 years.
And somebody was sitting next to you?
Yes, so this person sitting beside me, I was at the window. From the moment I sat down, she was watching me quite intently, which I found quite strange. I had some paperwork to fill out for the cruise, which had all my name, my details. But the whole time, sort of, I could feel her eyes totally on me for the whole time. And I just kept thinking, what's this woman watching me for?
Leah was being watched by Jody Harris, Australia's reigning Queen of Con. Harris was on the run, wanted by police in 3 states.
In that period in 2006, she's really ramped it up. She's on a spree, a tri-state fraud spree.
But to understand Jody Harris, we need to go back to 1989, when she was an 11-year-old growing up in Brisbane.
Jody's story is one about a very difficult, traumatic childhood. Her mother goes to jail when she's 11 years of age.
Harris's mother is Debbie Kilroy. Now she's a high-profile lawyer, social worker and public advocate for the rights of women in jail. But back in 1989, she was living a very different life.
And Kilroy is over! Try to the Bronco!
Just after 7 this morning, the Broncos winger walked into CIB headquarters accompanied by his solicitor.
Debbie's second husband and Harris's stepfather is Joe Kilroy, a Broncos league star who also wore the number 5 jersey for Queensland in State of Origin. But Joe and Debbie were leading a double life. They were dealing drugs from home, and police caught them in an undercover sting.
Although Kilroy dealt in the lesser drugs of cannabis and hashish, the prosecutor referred to him as an active seller, on occasions assisting wife Deborah in her drug-related activities. Deborah Kilroy was sentenced to 2 years for the supply of heroin, 4 years for trafficking, and 2 years for possession of property, namely $1,600 from drug sales, to be served concurrently.
Joe Kilroy was also sent to prison, and 11-year-old Jody, she was sent to live with other family members, one of whom allegedly abused her.
And so basically at that point in her life, every solid foundation she has behind her has gone. Her life has changed irreparably. She is engaged in a deep trauma. So at 11, struggling to find identity, she has none. By the time she's 14, she's committing theft. She was well known to police by the time she reached adulthood. And her response to it is basically, you know, the third digit of her hand at society. She's telling everyone to get stuffed.
In March 2006, now aged 27, Jody Harris was on her way to Brisbane and was about to pull off a mid-air heist.
We got chatting, and pretty much she started telling me her life story.
And what was that?
She told me her family owned Gambaro Seafood in Brisbane.
That was the first lie, and the next one soon followed.
I asked her what she did for a job. She said she worked for ANZ or one of the banks. Not psychology, but it was something like that. I was like, oh, sounds like an interesting role.
As a flight attendant and someone you're dealing with people all the time, I'm sure you've got what we call, in the technical terms, a good bullshit detector.
Yeah.
Was it ringing?
Well, maybe not really. Like, I was a bit like, oh, no, I actually put my trust in her that she was telling me a true story. I didn't believe that she was lying.
By the end of this conversation, you're feeling fairly comfortable with her.
Yeah, fairly comfortable.
And then you decide you have to go to the bathroom.
I went to the bathroom.
But you've left your handbag. Did you think at any moment about your handbag when you were in the bathroom?
Never do. Must say I never do, especially travelling business class. Even economy. I've seen it for years. People leave their bags under the seat, they go to the toilet, they'll go for a walk. And when I came back to my seat, and it was just before landing, and I went to my bag to get my lipstick, I looked in my bag and I thought, my bag doesn't look like I left it. But it wasn't until about maybe 5 hours later, I got to the cruise ship. And I needed to show my photo ID. And when I went to my wallet, my licence was gone.
Leah didn't join the dots straight away. Maybe she'd just misplaced her driver's licence. So she used her Qantas ID to board the ship.
We had no internet. We had no way of my husband calling me or anything. And it wasn't until we actually got off the cruise ship and were back at shore in Brisbane, and I've rang home. My husband, he said, we've had $10,000 stolen. And I've just gone, what? And he's gone, yeah, we've had 2 lots of $5,000 taken 2 days in a row. And I said, we can't have, where's it gone?
The money had gone straight from Leah's bank account into Harris's designer handbag.
1 lot in Brisbane on the day I arrived in Brisbane, and 1 lot in Melbourne the next day. I was hysterical pretty much from that moment on. I was just like beside myself, stressed out of my brain, thinking, what the hell's happened? You know, my husband's having a freak out. We had no access to any money, nothing. Couldn't even go to the hole in the wall and take out $20. This continued for 6 months. 6 months, we had all our accounts at ANZ frozen.
Coming up, the Queen of Con crosses the thin blue line.
She wants police. This is revenge.
It's March 2006, and Leah Jury discovers that $10,000 has been stolen from her family's bank account. She flies back to Melbourne wondering who could have done this. But before she reports this matter to police, she goes along to her bank.
And then you were shown a photograph.
And as soon as I was shown that photograph from the bank, I knew exactly who it was. I said, that was that lady beside me on that flight.
This was Harris at work in 2006, convincing a bank teller that she was someone else. In order to become Leah Jury, all she needed was a driver's licence.
The entire persona and training of a bank teller is to help the customer.
He's an inspector now, but back in 2006, Paul Bertoncello was a detective with Victoria Police. He had the task of tracking down the elusive Jody Harris and got to know her MO intimately.
So, we had on footage a number of times where, a bank teller turned the screen around to confirm, oh, is this the account you're talking about? And they're talking to Jody Harris, not Jill Bloggs. And of course, Jody, she had an incredible memory, an incredible eye for numbers. Sometimes we look at computer screens and it just looks like the Matrix if you don't know what you're looking at. However, she was able to discern the important information or identify another account that she didn't know about previously and then go into a different bank and use that.
Was there a moment where you thought, oh, this person, she's actually pretty good?
Oh, she was good.
In 2006, Despa Fitzgerald was an investigations manager with New South Wales Police. She was seeing the same pattern of criminal behaviour from Harris as her police counterparts in Victoria.
She had a knack. She had a knack of going into banks. She had a knack of, standing over bank tellers and saying it was her in the documentation.
Police in New South Wales and Victoria eventually formed a joint task force to bring Jody Harris to justice.
Well, it was a big operation. In relation to her getting around, she would also just jump on a plane and go to Melbourne, commit crime, then come to Sydney or even go to Queensland and South Australia. So trying to pin her in one spot was difficult.
Police could never be sure who they were dealing with at any given time. Jody Harris was a master of disguise. She travelled with a suitcase of wigs and outfits, and in an instant, she could flip from blonde to brunette. The next day, she's a redhead. Whatever it took to get what she wanted, and always at someone else's expense.
She would wear different disguises, wigs, scarves. I would say she was a good actress in very different roles that she played throughout her offending.
Some believe there's a much deeper aspect to Jody Harris's offending. She didn't like police. It may have begun when she was 11 years old, seeing her mother Debbie being arrested on drug charges.
She would be aware that police have tried to pin offences on her mother that were not attributable to her. These offences ultimately do not proceed through the courts. So she has a very unhealthy dislike of police at this stage. And I think as she develops into adulthood, she decides she's going to take a few down along the way.
In September 2001, Jody Harris walked into Melbourne's Fitzroy Police Station and flashed a fake badge, claiming to be a visiting cop from New South Wales. She'd done the same thing 3 years earlier at the Roma Street headquarters of Queensland Police. While she loathed police, she was also drawn to them. She had a relationship with a 32-year-old Victorian policeman when she was just 15. Before she travelled to Melbourne to see him, she sent him this photo.
She was able to convince him that she was 21, and he believed that, purportedly. These are the people, collectively, who have put her mother away. So this is revenge. She's very bright, she picks things up, and when she's having discussions with police, she's talking to them, she's gleaning information about procedures, investigative procedures, how they go about things. She knows she can commit fraud to the value of about $20,000 and no one's going to pursue her, even in those days.
A few months after Harris stole $10,000 from Leah Jury, Leah was reimbursed by her bank, the ANZ. But she wasn't the only one watching when the money went back into her account.
We'd opened a new account and changed the passwords, and within 2 days of us having that account closed and a new account open, the password got changed again. And that was not by me. She still had more access, so she got another $5,000 somewhere else a few days after that got put back. So all up, there's 4 transactions of $5,000. I'm disappointed that she could do that to somebody, and to think that she knew that I had a young family. I mean, Craig and I were fighting. We had no money. We were trying to pay a mortgage, trying to pay bills. And it's just been, I don't know, it feels like a bloody nightmare that I don't know when it's going to end.
Next, will the real Jody Harris please stand up?
My exact words were, "You've got to be kidding. I can't prove that I am who I am."
It's May 2006 and Jody Harris is on a crime spree. For months she's been flying up and down the East Coast, picking off victims at random in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. Victoria Police were hot on her trail. They knew who they were looking for, however, they had no idea where Jody Harris was. So they devised a clever plan.
They have no chance of making an arrest unless they're lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. So they get hold of a journalist at the Herald Sun and said, let's make this a big story.
$4 million pairs of eyes and ears are better than my 2, and away we went.
The front page story and the photo drew out many more tales of Harris's criminal prowess.
She'd steal from shop assistants. She stole from a masseuse. She stole from a gym attendant at a hotel in Melbourne. She stole ID and bank cards and bought a dog, leaving the dog up in Sydney. One of the most extraordinary cases was when a woman fell down in the street, knocking her head, knocking herself out. And Jody walked up to the crowd, gathered around her and just said, "Leave it with me, I'm a doctor." Then accompanied the woman in the back of an ambulance to hospital, stealing her ID and bank card on the way, and then delivering her into the hands of the hospital and just walking off and on her merry way to commit offences.
On that occasion, Harris relieved the injured woman of over $10,000. That crime was reported, but many other fraud victims don't come forward.
I've had cases where people, very prominent people in the community, have been caught up in these schemes, and they certainly don't want it out there that they have been suckered like this.
Tim Watson-Munro is a criminal psychologist and has assessed many con artists.
The sort of generic thing about them all is that they get excited about it, they enjoy it, they have a great belief in their own ability and very high egos, and that's what makes them so successful, because they can convince others as to their bona fides. They come across as very confident.
I felt really stupid, and people would say to me, you know, how did that happen to you? And I'm like, well, I didn't really do anything to make it happen to me.
Thanks to all the publicity from the first Herald Sun splash, Jody Harris was identified. She'd become Australia's most wanted con artist. But instead of retreating into her shell, she maintained a lavish lifestyle, paying cash to stay in the best hotels and spending big on luxury goods.
With her background, this is stuff that would be unattainable normally. So this, you know, this is Louis Vuitton, 24-carat gold, jewellery, etc. You know, this is her way of saying, I'm entering into a world that I'm not supposed to go into, and I'm going to help myself.
In a follow-up newspaper article, the Herald Sun gave Jody a new nickname.
That's how they describe Jody, as the catch me if you can con woman. Leonardo DiCaprio's movie. Because she was so good at what she did. Every time I had a passenger come on the aircraft, I was looking for her to see if she was going to board my plane, to the point that one day I actually was convinced she was on the aircraft. She was in business class. She was in 5 Alpha, and this lady really, really looked like her.
Leah alerted the captain, who called the authorities. The plane sat on the tarmac until the police arrived. Little did they know, they were about to arrest the wrong woman.
3 uniformed police officers come in. Excuse me, ma'am, I looked up and they're standing there. Can we escort you off the plane, get your luggage? And I'm like, okay.
They were convinced, the police were convinced it was her.
My exact words were, you've got to be kidding. I'm in trouble here. I can't prove that I am who I am.
They said, you're not going to believe it. We were positive it was her. He said, until we did her fingerprints, it wasn't her. And I just went, oh my God, are you serious? And I felt like a absolute, you know, idiot.
And when I got out, I burst into tears.
It was definitely a case of mistaken identity, and regretfully, this wasn't the person who we were looking for.
And this woman never flew Qantas again. I'm joking.
Meanwhile, the real Jody Harris was feeling invincible. She always seemed to be a step in front of the police. But she wanted to keep them interested. So she upped the stakes in the pursuit.
You're sitting in the office after the Herald Sun story goes to press. The phone rings.
So a woman claiming to be Jody Harris gets on the phone, and I probably thought it was a wind-up from some of the people I was working with at the time.
Bertoncello soon realised it wasn't a wind-up. Jody Harris, the Queen of Con, was on the line.
The first thing that went through my head once I did work out it was her was that it was pretty brazen, and you know, there was a sense of taunting there that you know, she was free and we didn't have her in our custody.
Coming up, police make a shocking discovery.
One thing led to another, and a neighbour said, "Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure she lives there with a police officer."
Serial con artist Jody Harris brazenly called Paul Bertoncello, the Victorian policeman who was chasing her. She teased him with clues about her location. She suggested he try the trendy suburb of South Yarra.
It was sort of one of those challenges that you're always up for as an investigator. She talked about being near a certain street and certain intersection in South Yarra. We came up with a plan to go and door knock all the units in the vicinity of that area. There's a lot of them. One thing led to another, and a neighbour of this particular unit, they said, "Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure she lives there with a police officer."
Andrew Twining was a motorcycle cop, an acting sergeant in Victoria Police.
Jody meets Andrew Twining on a internet dating site where she'd established a fairly elaborate personality. Here's a young woman any virile, hot-blooded male would be all over. There's the hints of bisexuality, light bondage and all this sort of stuff. You know, when you've got a profile like that, you're going to get a lot of hits. She's basically saying, come and get me, but not just anyone. She wants police. And one police officer who'd been in the force for almost 2 decades was Andrew Twining. They established a relationship, and it was, at least as far as he was concerned, perfectly normal and natural. It was a sexual relationship. She used to visit their parents. They'd go out for dinners.
Andrew's father, himself a former fraud squad officer, says Jody was a master con woman.
Everything she told us was a lie. She told us she was employed at Virgin Airlines as a cabin supervisor, and she's never worked for them at all.
And she had the uniform. She'd just turn up in the uniform, or she'd have the uniform in the cupboard in her apartment in Melbourne. So it was credible, you know, I mean, credible enough anyway.
Twining dated Harris for about 3 months, but was oblivious to her double life. He was overseas when news broke of her real identity and life as a con artist.
The sense of betrayal that he must have felt must have been extreme, I imagine.
Yeah, look, you certainly felt sorry for the guy. But, you know, from an investigation point of view, really my first loyalty was to the victims, and then obviously to bring her to justice.
Jody Harris continued to sidestep the police. But now they knew her real name, they began closing in.
So of particular impact in this investigation were the financial institutions, car hire companies, banks and airlines. We'd find a new identity that was being used, circulated, and that would then inform us, was she here or was she there? We often got within, you know, a day or two of where she was.
And then in Sydney, they came to within a few moments of catching her.
The one time I know that we were closest to catching her was in New South Wales, where Jody went into a bank. She was recognised by the teller. In the background, they put the alert out to get police to come there. Jody was nothing if not paranoid about any sort of delay that was occurring, and she would just cut her losses, and she did on this occasion. She walked out of the bank and went to cross the road, and the police car attending the bank stopped to let her cross in front of them. And then drove up, went into the bank, and they worked out, oh, that was the woman we just saw.
We knew she was in and around some of the shops, but we kept on missing her.
So you're literally minutes behind her as she's committing offences?
Minutes behind her.
Police in 3 states were frustrated by the elusive con artist. But they did have a potential line to Harris through her relationship with Sergeant Andrew Twining in Victoria. Twining's bosses asked him to help entrap the Queen of Con, and he was more than happy to oblige.
Next, the chase is on for the Queen of Con. But will she slip the net again?
And we basically commandeered a taxi and said, follow that car, as you
Like in the movies?
Like the movies.
Andrew Twining was away on a European cruise with his parents when police discovered his relationship with Jody Harris. Twining agreed to assist the police in arresting her as soon as he returned to Melbourne. The date for the sting was set, July 6, 2006.
Andrew arranged to meet Harris in Sydney. He got in his car and started the long drive up the Hume Highway. Victoria Police tracked the car all the way from Melbourne.
And it was around about 2 o'clock in the morning when I got a phone call to say Andrew was on his way to meet Jody. So I contacted my boss and we scrambled, we got staff out.
Twining told his superiors at Victoria Police that Harris was going to emerge from Scruffy Murphy's Irish pub in Sydney's CBD at 4 a.m.
Other people were out and about, so we put various police at various points. Myself and the crime manager at the time were masquerading down the street as if we were boyfriend and girlfriend, so we didn't look out of place, and we're expecting her just to walk out.
The stakeout was in full swing at the appointed rendezvous time of 4 a.m. But instead of emerging from the pub, as they'd been informed, Harris had a surprise in store for the New South Wales Police.
She gets out of a taxi and she gets into Andrew's car. My crime manager, Grant Taylor, and I were on foot, and we basically commandeered a taxi and said, follow that car.
Like in the movies?
Like the movies. Grant Taylor was in the front, I was in the back. Had the police radio and I was calling our other cars as to where we were going. A couple of minutes later, she was pulled over in Harris Street at Ultimo. I jumped out of the cab and she was placed under arrest.
The elusive Jody Harris finally in police custody.
How you feeling, Jody?
When Harris was arrested this morning, detectives also found credit cards, licences and a police ID. The number of women allegedly fleeced is still unclear, but in Melbourne alone, police say there were more than 20 victims who lost hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Leah Jury is with Darren Lunny, who joins us now.
What was your reaction when you heard the news this morning?
My dad rang me at 7:20 this morning and said they've got that woman, and I yelled, "Yay, finally!"
When she was arrested, she was very dirty on Andrew Twining. The penny dropped very, very quickly that Twining had betrayed her.
I can find one of you, I'll tell the truth, I'll tell you everything. Andrew Twining, ask him where he is.
6 days after Jody's arrested, police conduct a search at Twining's premises and find a replica handgun. What's he doing with a replica handgun? And that's what he goes down for and ultimately loses his job.
Andrew Twining has been suspended from duty indefinitely after being charged with possessing an unregistered handgun. Prosecutors said they were in possession of 100 or so pages of love letters between Twining and Harris.
The only way they caught her was the boyfriend. So I feel sorry for the poor boyfriend because, you know, he lost his job.
She's then in custody, and you get a chance to talk to her. What are your memories of that encounter?
Well, it was quite startling, her photographic memory. We eventually charged her with 133 offences. When we arrested her, she did have a bag full of credit cards. Each one of them, she was able to rattle off the numbers that she used, which was extraordinary.
Like most con artists, Jody Harris was eager to show the police how clever she was. She was angry too, letting fly with a vile tirade against her interrogators. Police didn't care, she could rant all she wanted. For years, Jody had led them on a merry dance. Now the cops were firmly in control.
What were your impressions of her as a person?
She was a fraudster, to me. She was clever, and if she diverted those skills somewhere else, she would have been a very successful business person in her own right. However, she was a fraudster, and that's all she was.
Might have made a good undercover policeman, maybe even.
I think she did that quite well.
Next. Wearing a black T-shirt which read "Doin' Time," Jody Harris looked relaxed as she sat in the dock.
Harris faces justice.
This is National 9 News with Peter Hitchener.
Alleged catch-me-if-you-can thief Jody Harris has appeared in court charged with stealing more than $160,000 in cash, property and airline tickets.
Harris's first appearance in court provoked massive media interest.
Damien, good morning. This case has really captured the public's attention, hasn't it?
Of course, it's created a lot of interest because police will allege there are a lot of victims. Apparently in Victoria alone, there are at least 20 alleged victims, and we know of at least 3 from the Sydney's eastern suburbs who will obviously give evidence in this case.
You know, would you say she had remorse? Really, she shows very little remorse for her victims in the initial stages, because this is a person who's basically been running around without restraint for 15 years.
Wearing a black T-shirt which read "Doin' Time," Jody Harris looked relaxed as she sat in the dock. She even laughed and smiled during the brief appearance.
In September 2006, Jody Harris admitted to stealing more than $300,000 worth of cash and property in New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria.
Slowly it's starting to dawn on her that she's looking at a nice old stretch in prison, and she's starting to get a sense of where she is now and what her prospects are.
Seizing the chance for a sentence reduction, Harris assisted in making a training video with the fraud squad in Victoria. In the video, she pointed out all the gaps in the banking system that allowed her to use multiple identities to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. The video was then used in banking and finance circles as an educational tool.
It enabled her to say to the court that she'd been assisting Victoria Police. So certainly, you know, consistent with sort of Jody's view of the world. She helped herself, but, you know, she helped us as well.
Harris was sentenced to 4 years jail. In 2010, after serving her time, she faced a Brisbane court for her Queensland crimes, where she received a suspended sentence. She was accompanied by her mother, Debbie Kilroy.
Remember, Debbie Kilroy went to jail over a drug matter, but she goes on to become a lawyer, and now she's held in very, very high regard in judicial circles in Queensland. Jody looks at her mother and says, here's the way to break this cycle. So Jody actually starts studying Koori studies and begins a Master of Arts. 10 years later, no more problems.
There's no evidence that Jody Harris has reoffended since her release from jail in 2010. So, has she been rehabilitated? Crime historian Peter Hoysted says yes. She's come a very long way since the time as an 11-year-old when the two most important people in her life were taken away from her.
She's offending probably from the time she's 14 to about the time she's 28. You know, the media wanted to pump this up as a catch me if you can, Leonardo DiCaprio in drag sort of, you know, fascination. And certainly that's the way a lot of people saw it. But this is a story about redemption. This is a story about family reconnection. This is a story about a person who had lost her way through really no fault of her own. And then she has this big moment of reckoning under a massive glare of media, and then it stops.
The detective who led the investigation in Victoria is encouraged by Harris's progress.
If I could speak to her today, I'd say congratulations on keeping out of our sphere of influence for the last 10 years, and I hope that continues for a long time to come.
I don't know. Yes, you look at her mum, you know, she has turned her life around. But I don't know whether Jody will. But, yeah, I think people need to really be aware of, you know, where you're handing out your cards and just, you know, don't let those cards out of your sight. I must say, though, I don't trust people like I used to. And I go with my gut. If my gut tells me something, my God, do I listen to it.